Hey friends, I'm Otis Gibbs, and this is Grant Alden. He's going to talk about the history of No Depression magazine.
In the beginning, there were 4 of us, and we were all sort of kicking around loose in Seattle. I had left the Rocket and opened an art gallery, which was the stupidest financial thing I ever did in my life, even stupider than all the $500 cars I bought. So I was doing that and starving to death. And Eric Flanagan, who went on to be a VP at Disney or some nonsense, was kicking around. He'd come back from Austin, I think, or I don't know what he was doing. He was loose. And Peter Blackstock, my co-editor and co-founder, was the nighttime copy editor at the Seattle Post-Intelligencer and a part-timer at a couple of magazines, including The Rocket. But he was from Austin, and so he filled in some of the pieces that I couldn't have credibly filled in. And then Mary Shue, who was the office manager at The Rocket, who was Peter's landlord and then became my landlord. Mary was the person who had an extra ticket to Lyle Lovett's first show, who introduced me to the Tailgaters and the Paladins and lots of really cool music, and she had great taste. And she just was into the music. And so we just started talking. We met in a sports bar near Green Lake. And Eric found another path, but Peter and I were sort of stubborn about it. Charlie Cross, who owned The Rocket, also owned Backstreet Magazine. And so I'd watched how he operated that business, and I knew a few things about publishing. Seattle was hot. Peter and I both had credibility in the reporting, and the publicists knew who we were. Editors and other magazines knew who we were, so we weren't just a couple of guys starting something. So there were 3 compilations. There was a the first Bloodshot compilation, the first Diesel-only compilation, and then this thing out of California called Pushing the Norton. But from those compilations, I was pretty confident that there was a lot of talent. There were a lot of people doing the same kind of things. And the catechism, what I preached for years, was that what Bryan Adams ended up singing, punk rock is too hard to sing. And there were a lot of people who were going to age out of punk rock, but not out of the sensibility. And country was a logical place to go. It was sort of this abandoned warehouse, because Nashville was doing Garth Brooks and Shania Twain. And then there were the Waco Brothers and all these other carpetbaggers out of Minneapolis and all these cool bands that nobody really heard of. And then there was this thing called the internet. So the Uncle Tupelo fan group on America Online was renamed No Depression when the band broke up. And that was where we got writers and contact and distribution help and got a sense of what the marketplace could possibly be for the magazine we were going to start. It was never a point he was prepared to argue with me. He always knew that's what the name was. And it worked really well. It was the past, it was the Carter family. It was the present, it was No Depression's Uncle Tupelo, it was punk rock discovering country music, and it was the future that the internet offered us. It was all of those things. It was I don't know how many people noticed, but so Backstreet's magazine, at the end of all the feature stories, they have the tennis shoes hanging. That's a Springsteen icon. We always had pills that had N and D in them. I don't know if anybody ever noticed it.
I don't know that I did.
I actually had 1 or 2 people in the early days of the magazine reach out to me electronically and complain that we were making fun of mental illness. And I said, and one in particular complained about the pills, and I said, I'm from Seattle. If you don't get irony, I can't help you. At my favorite line from Mark Arm of Mudhoney, irony does not translate in Japanese. And it's my native tongue. I'm sorry. So anyway, we had all of these pieces, and I had worked as a typesetter, and I'd done page makeup, and I'd built magazines, and I knew how to do it. We sold enough advertising that first issue to break even, which was good because I didn't have any money. And Warner Brothers bought a box of them because we put Sunvolt on the first cover. And I remember I moved from Seattle to LA as that issue was coming off the press. And in the back of the pickup truck, the back of my moving van, was this box of No Depression #1 that Rick Gershon came over, and he sold me his car, and he bought those magazines for publicity, and that made the first issue profitable. We never failed to be profitable. We did not pay ourselves for a period of time, but we always operated in the black. So I moved to LA to work for Raygun, which was a really weird juxtaposition. So I'm doing No Depression, and I'm then doing this really hip cutting-edge graphic design magazine with David Bowie on every 7th cover or something. And they got a junket to Japan. And they came back and they were really mad because they walked into Tower Tokyo and there was No Depression and Raygun wasn't there. And I had this sort of like, well, yeah, we know what we're doing. We're not idiots. I was tactical about what it looked like. The writing was always professional. The design was meant to look a little worse than I could really have done. But some of that was that we were doing it on a computer and I had to learn how to do PageMaker. I was used to doing it all by hand. That took a fair time. Some of the designers at Raygun were kind enough to teach me a little bit, but they used Quark, and so it was different. But I used to pour files into Word, into columns, go down to Kinko's and run them out, cut them up, paste them down, and that was how we built No Depression for the first couple of years. We printed 2,000 copies of the first issue, and it went up from there. The high point, I think we printed 40,000. It wasn't always obvious that there was as much talent out there as I thought there was, that we wouldn't be going back to the same people over and over again. It was also not obvious. It took us a while to get to the point where the other pieces of the magazine were available to us. That is, we could get a Merle Haggard cover. We could talk to Dolly Parton, although she was really good and did an early issue with us. We did Loretta Lynn a couple of times, and we were able to get those people in part because I'd moved to Nashville, and in part because we had a cachet by that point. We had issues with printers occasionally. We outgrew a series of printers until we actually found a professional magazine shop instead of just somebody that could do it. Other than that, it went pretty well. It had a pretty good work-life balance, except for the 2 weeks of production. As I said, I'd started an art gallery in Seattle. And one of the things, we did 3 things. We did Southern folk art, so we had some Howard Finster and Michael Finster and that kind of stuff. And we had the Frank Kozik posters and all the other people who were doing that. And then we had Seattle rock photography. So I represented Charles Peterson, Alice Wheeler, and Lance Mercer. And I'd worked at The Rocket, which was a very graphic-centered magazine. Raygun was very graphic-centered. I think I'm a pretty good judge of photographers. I have a particular thing I like. I like black and white documentary photography. I don't like Photoshop. I don't like fancy. I don't remember how I first met Jim. I remember going to his house more than once in East Nashville and picking up stuff or delivering stuff. But it was quickly apparent to me that he was a special talent and that the only way I could really pay him was to give him access. The rock magazines I worked for were notorious for exploiting photographers. You'll get exposure. You'll get portfolio pieces. I'm like, eat that. We paid our contributors as well as we could because Peter and I had both been freelancers. There were people who we knew needed to work to make rent. And we tried to take care of some part of that as best we could. My goal was to create an environment in which the greatest number of people possible could avoid having to have a straight job. And that meant musicians, managers, artists of all kinds, writers. That's what I wanted. Jim was really easy for me to work with because he was great. He was an immensely talented guy, is an immensely talented guy. I worked with a really small group of photographers. Charles Peterson shot a couple covers for me in Seattle. Alice Wheeler shot a bunch of stuff for me. Marina Chavez shot for me in LA. Aldo Moro shot for me in New York, shot the Elvis Costello cover, a bunch of other stuff. I mean, I worked with a pretty small group of people because it gave us a graphic identity, and it saved me the trouble of saying no to everybody else. I never wanted to shut it down. I had worked from the time I was 15, 14. My first publication was a typewritten scandal sheet in junior high school with carbon paper. I would type it out twice, and try not to change anything the second time. I was co-editor, I was art director, I was co-publisher. It was like Outer Limits. I controlled the horizontal and the vertical. I mean, I didn't. Peter had a stronger editorial voice than I generally did, and Kyla took tremendously good care of us on the business side, as did Mary Shue. But this was my dream job. This was all I had worked to my entire professional career. I was getting to write about music I loved, to design it, to work with photographers, and illustrators who I adored, to call up or email famous writers and say, hey, would you like to write for this magazine that people think is cool? And we'll pay you 10 cents a word or whatever it was. And some of them said yes. I mean, what was better than that? At the same time, we came out 6 times a year. That was as much as Peter wanted to do, and I was getting a little restless. So I had put together a proposal and actually shopped it in Nashville to do a mainstream country magazine. I called it Modern Country. And Bill Friskus Warren was on board to be my editor and to do most of the work, but I wanted to design a second magazine and to build a bigger publishing empire. And Peter and Kyla were not in favor of this, but they hadn't said no yet. And so I went through the process of building that business plan, which I don't think I do the way people with MBAs do, but I imagined numbers. And I took meetings in Nashville because I could get meetings in Nashville. And I remember very clearly sitting in Sony's boardroom or meeting room, and these 3 marketing executives sat there and said, yeah, we think this would be great, because what I wanted to do, country at this point was having another credibility scare with Miranda Lambert, who was on the cover of a late issue of No Depression, and Dierks Bentley, and this whole group. And I thought, there isn't a country music magazine. There is no place they can go to talk seriously about the music and not about what they're making for breakfast. And I can do that. And I understand how niche publishing works. I recognize that it doesn't have to be a big circulation magazine. It just has to be in the marketplace. And if the record labels will support it in the way that they support No Depression to drive retail sales, we're good. So in this meeting, I said, so if we were to start this, what kind of advertising support should we anticipate from you guys? Sony Music. They said half page a year. And that was the end of that discussion. But because I'd been thinking about it, there were some other things happening. Our ad revenues were declining. Napster was happening. If music is free, there's no point in record labels buying ads in a print magazine to support that music. We were a credible international magazine from issue 2 because the magazine buyer at Tower put us in every store. And I don't know who that person is, but thank you. Tower folded. Record retail folded. It went away. There was a sweet spot for independent niche magazines, not just music, but of all kinds, about 35,000 to 40,000 print run. 10,000 of that was paid subscribers, and the rest went on newsstands. All those newsstands were going away. And I looked at the numbers, and Kyla kept screaming at us that she could not sell the size magazine we were producing. Not screaming, but insisting that we pay attention. And because I'd just gone through this other process of thinking about this other magazine, it was really clear to me when I looked at the year-end numbers that we could not do it. And then the discussion was, well, do we taper off or do we quit? Peter would have preferred to taper back down to the size magazine we started and keep doing it. I had too much pride. I did not want to go back to the people who contributed to the magazine and say, no, we're going to pay you less because the economy's changed. I didn't want to produce a lower quality product, having worked so hard to learn how to do the job of designing a magazine that I thought was credible on the national stage. I didn't want to write shorter articles. No Depression, it's funny, we're sitting in Sawstone, and the bartender downstairs when I came in was playing Lonesome Bob. Now, I introduced him to Lonesome Bob a week ago, and one of Lobo's albums is on Spotify, the other one's not. Peter Cooper wrote a Lonesome Bob profile for No Depression. And I remember calling him up and saying, hey, can you add another 1,000 words to this piece? Well, somebody dropped out and we had some extra space, and I couldn't cut a section, so it's like, let's just make this better. Because that's what we did. We were the place where the operating hunch was, it's too loud, too old, or too weird, we'll write about it. And Lobo was all of those things, and he was really good. And who else was going to publish a 5,000-word story on Lonesome Bob? Nobody. That's what I was there for. You know, I'm as proud of that as I am that we got 2 Loretta Lynn covers, because Loretta Lynn didn't have anything new to say. Did it make any difference to Lobo? No. Did calling Alejandro Escovedo Artist of the Decade help him? Actually, he has been kind enough to say that it might have. Did it embarrass the hell out of Buddy Miller when we did it on the last issue of the print magazine? It did. That's worth something too. I love Buddy. We published in our editor's note that we were going to close, and hoped that somebody would buy it, that someone else would have a better idea of how to make a transition that I could see coming. We went to South by Southwest and took meetings, and at South by Southwest, Harp closed. Bluegrass Unlimited closed. Bluegrass Now closed. I want to say there was another magazine that just ended public. The marketplace went away that fast. And it's never come back. There's not a way to do it. There is no newsstand. There is no record label advertising support to drive a niche magazine, and that's true of knitting, and it's true of all kinds of things. Does it exist online? Maybe, but online doesn't do 5,000-word stories on Lonesome Bob. And if it were online, no one would want to read it, because that's just not what your phone is good at. That's what print's good at. And you know, God love the New Yorker and Vanity Fair and whatever else is out there that I don't have time to read. There's not much of that being nurtured in the writing world these days. And I think that's a shame.